Effects of a balanced literacy program on ELAA scores for special education students. Early literacy alternate assessment. My name is Katie Malone, and I've been in education now for 16 years. I received my undergrad at Buena Vista University, and I'm currently receiving my graduate at Morningside. My current assignment is at the Harlan Community School District as a K-5 Level 3 special educator. You can see on the side I have my folder number and all my license and endorsements. The state, by the use of the new K-6 Early Literacy Alternate Assessment, has set high expectations for special education students with an intellectual disability to reach individualized targeted skill levels in literacy. How can special education teachers implement instructional practices that provide access to strategies students can utilize to achieve higher gains in early literacy alternate assessments in order for students to reach their targeted skill level? So really, we need to find out how our students learn the best and what strategy is going to work. Erickson states that teachers need to shift their thinking from the conventional one-to-one teaching in isolation to a more balanced approach that will in any single day address all areas of literacy. Why did I choose this topic? I guess because I wanted to research it because it was a new alternate assessment that had been given to my students within the last 2 years, and I wanted to know what teaching strategies would work best for student gains and student growth. Adequate yearly progress. The No Child Left Behind tells us and demands teachers to use effective teaching strategies for student success on standardized tests, as does Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is intended for teachers to instruct children in a way to meet their individualized needs that is stated on their IEPs as well as through their IEP teams. And it's a requirement by No Child Left Behind for states to meet adequate yearly progress in Common Core standards. Back 25 years ago, Howard Goldstein from Ohio State University says that literacy was not a priority for students with disabilities, and as it should be for the highly literate world that we live in. Goldstein says that literacy programs offered phonemic awareness, letter sound correspondence, and oral language. They assisted students in becoming successful readers. He also states that with students with significant developmental disabilities are still required to take these statewide tests, so they need to be taught to them. These assessments, the ELAA, they're focused on the Common Core Essential Elements, which is a modified curriculum for just the regular Common Core. My question is what did the students do before if they weren't learning reading and math? And unfortunately, back then, and even today, resources were very limited. Morgan and Morney reported that the limited amount of literacy resources to teach these learners is very hard for educators. And Usner et al. States that curriculum needs to reflect students' individualized abilities and needs and learning styles for higher instructional and assessment outcomes. Having more literacy resources to pull from would aid the teacher in adapting the materials for more convenience. Teachers are constantly adapting materials for grade levels, but when you don't even have anything to follow other than the essential elements and you're at all different grade levels, it makes things very hard to get adapted, accommodated, and modified for these students. Another important tool that Newman and Cunningham say is that these teachers, they need, and in order for no child to be left behind, progress requirements, they need professional development. They need professional development to teach how to teach these students. Teachers need to continually learn how to teach and the new strategies that are out there because there's not one student that learns the same. Literacy instructions needs to be a daily focus for all students and in every classroom. Classrooms of individuals with intellectual disabilities, in order for them to generalize their 21st century skills and become successful, productive members of society, they need to learn literacy and how to read and how to write. There's two strategies that my research focused on, and the first one was an isolated instruction, where this is a drill It's a drill and practice. It's a scope and sequence where you learn one skill or one strategy at a time, compared to the balanced literacy instruction, where this is a compilation of many different strategies that uses skill and meaning based instruction to obtain growth while teaching all 6 scales of the early literacy alternate assessment. Isolated instruction and a balanced literacy instruction play different roles, and research suggests that both of these instructional techniques are important in literacy. Spada and Light Brown also state that isolated skills instruction could be a benefit to students who need follow-up lessons from a balanced literacy approach. This research study had the theoretical framework of connectivism. This is the integration of principles explored by chaos, network complexity, and self-organization theories. Connectivism relates to education and to the study by allowing students to use a basic level task and connect it to a much larger space in which the learner functions with previously acquired knowledge. Simons continues to explain that learning is a process and not an event. Using a balanced literacy program and teaching every scale of the ELA daily, students will be able to continually use previously acquired knowledge to grow in the learning process. An isolated instruction strategy would not allow for patterns of growth and connecting previously acquired knowledge, but rather it would be considered just an event. The purpose of this study was to examine the effects of implementing a balanced literacy program for level 3 students in a self-contained classroom in Iowa. Basically, when the study started a little over a year ago, when I started researching it was a K3 early literacy alternate assessment. So just within the year, they've already changed it and moved it over to a K6. And the measurement to determine whether the isolated instruction or the balanced literacy, the measurement device was the K6 ELAA, and then it shows the 6 scales that are being assessed. With each scale, the researcher or I myself had to have 3 artifacts for each scale to show evidence of student learning. The hypothesis, I chose the use of a balanced literacy program for students with intellectual disabilities made higher gains on ELAA than with an isolated approach. My independent variable was the use of balanced literacy instruction, and my dependent variable was the early literacy alternate assessment. The possible impact that this study would have is where the results could be used to help teachers make decisions on which instructional approach to use for level 3 special education students taking the early literacy alternate assessment. The biggest gap in research that I found when looking through this study was that most of the research found is based on early literacy interventions used with the general education students and or level 1 or 2 special education students. The study was necessary because more research needs to be done to see if there is a specific instructional strategy that will benefit level 3 or intellectually disabled student success on literacy assessments, such as the new K6 ELAA that the state has put out. In the methods section, my participants were 3rd and 4th grade students. They were all level 3, intellectually disabled. There were 6 total, 4 boys, 2 girls. They had similar demographics. They all lived in a small rural community where there was high levels of free and reduced lunches, and 3 out of the 6 students were being raised by their grandparents. The materials was the 6 ELAA scales, and you can look through and see how they were being taught and how the evidence was being collected. The procedure during the phase A, the first 6 weeks of isolated instruction, this is where there were no interventions, and this is where I found my baseline score. There was no treatments at all. There was 15 minutes of direct instruction with 15 minutes of a drill and practice on the isolated concept. In phase B, for the second 6 weeks of the balanced literacy, 15 minutes was the balanced literacy instruction, using and identifying details, events, questioning, and the last 15 minutes really focused in more on drawing, dictating, writing, and using words to communicate and make those connections. The results, I used a single subject A-B research design. It was a 12-week study. The same students were assigned to both phases during these 2 time periods. I used a within group samples, dependent samples t-test. I still struggle with trying to explain all this today. The experimental phase slightly outperformed the control phase on the ELA test, and students were actually showing growth without intervention. The experimental phase outperformed the control phase on the ELA scores by 0.25%, and findings confirmed that it's difficult to support whether this instructional data was improving scores because students were showing growth without the intervention. Therefore, the hypothesis that the balanced literacy instruction was a successful intervention strategy for the success of the ELA scores was not supported here. The conclusion, the purpose of this study was to examine the effects of implementing a balanced literacy program for level 3 students in a self-contained classroom. As predicted, a balanced literacy instruction increased ELA scores more than the control phase of the isolated instruction. These findings were consistent with previous research by Bingham and Ken Hall, where they showed that the compilation of many different strategies that uses skill and meaning-based instruction will obtain growth in reading and writing amongst children. And these findings were also consistent with a previous research by Laura Gifford. They said that identifying students with significant intellectual disabilities had not been shown in previous interventions that had as much growth as were students that were instructed using a balanced literacy approach. So they supported the balanced literacy. The theoretical framework, connectivism, says that learning happens through connections, and connectivism relates to this research study because a balanced literacy attends to many stimuli that needs to be connected at once. Many level 3 special education students have short attention spans, and so information needs to be reviewed and taught often to keep retention. I don't feel that one strategy was not significantly better than the other. Although Salpata and Light Brown say that the both instructions, the isolated and the balanced literacy, are equally important when teaching literacy. File and Adams also support this study in that there was not a significant difference when using an isolated instruction compared to a balanced literacy instruction as found in their study. An isolated instruction is the drill and practice of one literacy strategy until the student meets the literacy strategy and masters that literacy strategy and moves on to the next. A balanced literacy instruction is a compilation of many different strategies that uses skill and meaning-based instruction to obtain growth. Spada and Light Brown state that isolated instruction, the scope and sequence, is most effective when used for follow-up lessons of the balanced literacy. So basically, both of these strategies are very important. It's just how we are using them. In the conclusion, I found the limitations. There was only a 12-week period, so it's a short amount of time. There was a small sample size. There were some behaviors, limited groupings, and there were external influences such as medication, doctor's appointments, and motivation. Some suggestions for future research would be a longer study, of course, a larger number of participants, grouping participants by the significance, and grouping students by behaviors. Some implications, participants and the researcher were consistent, so that's a plus. The Iowa Core essential elements are aligned to the K-6 early literacy alternate assessment, and IEP goals were aligned with the ELAA. In conclusion, findings tell us that it's difficult to support whether a balanced literacy instruction improves scores because students were already showing growth during the control phase of isolated instruction. In addition, findings also suggest that because there was a significant difference between the pretest and phase A, it's going to be hard to tell if there is a significant difference between phase A and phase B. Therefore, balanced literacy instruction may be an effective strategy for student gains on ELAA, but additional studies are needed to prove whether this is true. Thank you.